Hey detectives, from the ashes comes yet another episode, or case file, in the Death of a Game series. A series where we investigate the largest contributing factors to the death or dying of a game or company, by utilizing a timeline of events, developer testimonies, patch notes, and most importantly, a little detective intuition. This all culminates in a final deduction, where we crack the case for good, in case you missed any of the clues along the way. Ashes of Creation has been in the news heavily of late, with many rushing to put out their videos concerning a game they just learned about or one they previously glazed. But it's a project many of us, myself included, have had their eyes on since it was initially introduced to the public back in 2017, in a major way, becoming one of the most successful, fastest popping Kickstarters in gaming history, let alone MMORPG gaming history, a massive genre with an audience who's not so massive in size. Ashes of Creation and their development studio, Intrepid Studios, and then their helmsman, Steven Sharif, were making big promises. Promises on the surface to be the next big sandbox MMORPG to revive the genre. And behind the scenes, promises to be bigger than Fortnite, Apex Legends, and even World of Warcraft. Those promises would take a decade to come into fruition, and only recently did as of the launching of this video in 2026. AOC, as it's known for short, launched back at the end of 2025 on Steam into, early access alpha. And even after said launch, those aforementioned promises were seeming like a far-off reality, even after 10 years. And then in a shocking turn of events, the board would initiate a Warnak issuance, which would affect 210 developers in total, just a month after the Steam launch, letting them go and suddenly then having the executive leadership quit alongside them. This would lead to the pulling of Ashes of Creation off of the Steam store, preventing the development team from collecting a paycheck or any severance in the process as well. Steven has seemingly cut and run, banning people criticizing him in the Ashes of Creation Discord, and not making any public appearances. Wow, that's surprising, since the announcement, and Intrepid Studios was dissolved, obviously, acquired alongside the IP itself by a debt liquidation firm. That makes Ashes of Creation one of the longest hyped and never to deliver titles we have seen in the series yet, and period. And one of the largest failures in the MMORPG gaming and crowdfunding space, and yet the shortest actual run at things of the more recent virtual worlds. This case is a special one, detectives, understandably so, as not only do I have a lot to say about this particular case file, I have a lot more otherwise to say about the other actors involved in this case. Be prepared for a lot of I told you so, but hopefully mixed with enough analysis and good storytelling that you don't feel like I have too much of a chip on my shoulder. I am a detective after all. And on that note, we must begin our investigation, because this case is one of our deepest and most tangled yet. The story begins right before their big Kickstarter announcement, quietly, in the winter of 2016. We're creating an MMO based on our core principles as designers. We believe in choice, organic events, player narratives, and massive communities. All of these things come together in what we call our living world. Players will shape the world we create through dynamic quests, castle sieges, our settlement system, an economy that goes well beyond the auction house, and player housing, among many other systems. We'll set up the initial state, you decide where it goes from there. This was the initial sales pitch of Ashes of Creation. Justin Olivetti, an experienced video game journalist in the MMORPG space, would claim that things seemed a little bit dubious, as the history of those involved was not really known. Something quite important when making the most ambitious and difficult video game in video game design. A massively multiplayer online RPG. A style of online game that creates a new virtual world with new rules at a large or massive scale. This inevitably makes the game more ambitious, as the scale is much larger, and also capable of hosting many hundreds of players or thousands at the same time. So making sure you had an experienced team to do such, or at least one with tons of field experience, was crucial, as we've learned with other major failures in our series such as New World and more. And making sure you had the money required to do this as well was also going to be a major barrier for new titles that were going to be interested. On that note, that wasn't all you could find in this early announcement, a clue. Ashes of Creation claims to be funded thus far from the team lead's pockets and other limited investors, although there will be a Kickstarter coming in the future. This information would be important to pay attention to later on, but apparently AOC was able to secure funding before even having a proper development team or proper game demo. That was because, as would be later claimed hundreds of times or more, Steven Sharif, who was the CEO of Intrepid Studios and creative director on the project, would be self-funding the project. The idea being presented was this rich, powerful businessman with limited otherwise investment was a huge MMORPG fan and was willing to sacrifice his own fortune to create one of his own. Enter one of the strangest and biggest red flag Kickstarters I've seen in a while. And I said as much in my Kickstarter report card covering this as well, as I will cover much later. Ashes of Creation would jump into the public eye in a major way, May 2017, becoming one of the most successful Kickstarters ever, especially for such a niche MMORPG genre. The thing is, the entire pitch of Ashes of Creation is essentially nothing new for those in the know, nothing we haven't already seen, starting with their play on words regarding bringing massive back to massively multiplayer. An utterly throwaway comment that feels smart but shows a misunderstanding of the market. The large crop of virtual worlds that currently dominate, sure, aren't massive. That much is true, but then to equate that to meaning that somehow the other ones are still a genre that they don't actually apply to, just the small versions, makes no sense. The big crowning feature of the game was set to be the node system, a system that would allow for players to influence a zone which is made up of multiple nodes, and then build them up into actual remnants of civilization and even large cities like a metropolis. This would complement the fact that the game was factionless, reportedly being based on guilds and other allegiances instead. In reality, this game has already been tried and attempted before. In fact, it's largely two different MMORPGs kind of combined together that were also already featured in our Death of a Game series for very different reasons, sure. Star Wars Galaxies first, an iconic pioneering sandbox still yet outdone really from the early 2000s, one that allowed for civilization to be freeform anywhere on a planet capable of it, of which there are many. It also included a city management system that could grow with progression, much like a node. You then have Darkfall Online, a sandbox MMORPG that tried to prove that free-form player choice and factions could and would reign supreme, a theory they ultimately failed to prove multiple times. Both of these games not only taught lessons within, the things we covered in their separate episodes, they also showed us why these sorts of ideas worked and why they didn't. With Galaxies, the game worked not because it was a free-form city-building system, but because it had that system on top of a multitude of other strong systems, including their guild systems. Contrary to popular belief, even being a sandbox game, it actually had factions that were prominently featured. It was Star Wars after all. That's because, as the creator Raph Koster would say, a pioneer in the virtual world space too, sandbox was never meant to be the sole style of game. It was more so a thing because people hadn't created enough of the world yet, or figured out how. The idea of being this fully free-form sandbox game where players have to create kind of literally everything is a bit of a pipe dream, and actually more so exists in a subgenre of virtual worlds or online gaming, known as the survival gaming space. But they had to split from the MMORPG genre for players to largely accept that. But back to Darkfall for a second, the reason that game didn't work, at the core, was simple. Systems designed to allow players to be the ones behind the wheel are just simply put much more difficult to pull off. They take much more testing, and often lead to toxic gameplay and community gatekeeping. That's not to say that Ashes Creation's approach towards factionless couldn't work, but it felt unnecessary and regressive in design. And I mean, how was this exciting for people to hear? This was Ultima Online's selling point 18 years prior, but expectations had shifted. Where was the story? And where was the innovation? PC Gamer would see smoke and question a lot of the aspects of this said Kickstarter and the upcoming Project AOC, first pointing out that Sharif was promising to refund every donation if the game didn't launch, which made them skeptical he could deliver upon that. But again, according to Sharif and the Kickstarter itself, the project was reportedly already funded and was being funded as reiterated by Sharif himself. Writer Steven Messner would express doubts, though, that Intrepid Studios would have the talent to pull off this ambitious idea, period. As although the project would tout having a team with over 40 years of MMO experience, the team he had assembled thus far was anything but experienced for the job largely, at least at the higher end of things. While Intrepid Studios would brag about featuring a former EQ lead game designer, they didn't explain that that developer, Jeffrey Bard, was largely a customer service and QA liaison internationally, and then repurposed into a video game developer when EQ2 was fading. Worse was Sharif propping himself up as this expert of 25 years of experience of MMOs, which was an interesting claim, because they didn't actually exist for that long at the time. And in the same vein would claim that he had no experience in the industry, and his experience was largely business-related. That business-related experience was MLM in nature, by the way, as Sharif had worked for an MLM company called Zango, even becoming successful to be ranked alongside his mother, the true success there, on a top-ranked MLM list. Steven would admit this involvement, but heavily downplay the actual nature of things. In the same interview from 2017, Steven would claim that the project again was self-funded, and that any Kickstarter or post-funding was purely to add to additional scope. The rest of the interview is a bit of a dive into the character of Steven, as we will spend a lot of time highlighting throughout the video. This article is a bunch of nice words, without much actual content to it. Hell, many of the things that Steven espouses about are what I call in consultancy level 1 ideas. Ideas we have already seen, and ideas that didn't really work whenever they were implemented the first time. Here we can already see some of the seeds of doubt though. An inexperienced team led by an even more inexperienced leader. One who seemingly would come out of nowhere but wanted to be seen as all important and was really good at building influence and raising money. But Steven would promise to rectify doubts of scope, talent, and resources, creating a new San Diego studio dedicated to MMO development in the summer of 2018. The talent would then be filled with the remnants of Daybreak Games or SOE games, including some of the names that I already mentioned like Jeffrey Bard, but also people like Margaret Crone, and more. This was an addition to the team in Malaysia, who was also working on the in-game assets for the game. Injecting more controversy into things early on would be the announcement of a publishing agreement with My.com, a publisher responsible for some of the most egregious pay-to-win virtual worlds we've ever seen. This would create a pretty big scare amongst the player base and community, being worried about what this could mean for things to come. Having seen this movie before, while this would later be recanted as a publishing agreement for reasons unknown, it would serve as a clue for things to come. And then, to many people's surprise, Intrepid Studios would announce another project, reportedly an extension of their original game dubbed Ashes of Creation Apocalypse, and then launched on Steam December 8th, 2018, just 1 year before they were supposed to drop the Alpha 1. This project was completely confusing for me, and shows early on how willing to hold water for a company that fans of the MMORPG genre were. That's because although the project is advertised as a testing grounds for Ashes of Creation proper, it largely featured a Battle Royale gameplay mode not even featured in the MMORPG anyway. And what was shown, powered by the Unreal Engine 4, was pretty bare bones too, featuring a combat system that looked worse than games that were 6 years older. And before any defenders find their way to my comment section, as they probably will, the reason this thing was a total farce was because A, it sold skins in the shop, despite not being the same game, and B, testing grounds aren't done as public launches. They're vertical slices of vertical slices. The core demo here isn't even present for what Ashes of Creation is supposed to be about and represent. The other argument people make is, well, it was to test combat and castle sieging. Really? Then why did the combat system completely change to a less action-centric one and a more tab-target one, as you will see in the marked ear gameplay footage on screen, and as the video unfolds? And why do the visuals look almost nothing like what the game eventually became? Look, I'm gonna be honest. My theory on things is that Ashes of Creation Apocalypse was to try to convince people both behind the scenes, as we will find out more shortly, or everyone else, that progress was being made, despite it being absolutely a snail progress at the time. And all of this would make a lot more sense as some juicy never-before info was brought forth by a former investor of Ashes of Creation and a friend of Steven Sharif. Yes, you heard that right. Recently in a video with Nefas QS, they were able to contact one of the biggest investors behind the actual project, named simply for this video as Jason, and learn about some of the behind-the-scenes funding fiasco that was ongoing for the project for years. As a different altogether public-facing persona was continuously showcased, misleading the audience into believing that Ashes of Creation was really being self-funded by the same millionaire, and then being crowdfunded. I highly recommend watching Nefas QS's video on this topic, as it showcases tons of message correspondence, including Steven himself, where he would employ all of his MLM tactics he learned from his mom apparently to charm not just Jason as an investor, but according to the reports, even more investors. Ashes of Creation felt otherworldly, even without anything to prove for it by design. Steven Sharif would talk about wanting it to be the same size or bigger than World of Warcraft, a titan in the MMORPG industry. Steven would also exaggerate any metric or success his project would receive early on in development, and twist it in a way that would garner more support, and more importantly, more funding. For example, even counting things like Kickstarter funding as sales, something that feels so slimy a fish would be jealous. But more is showcased throughout these message chains, such as how inexperienced in business and development Sharif was, and how more focused on driving up the hype he seemed to be than actually approaching the genre academically. This is showcased by how little actual talent the company had, despite how much money was being involved. And that's the biggest bomb drop of all. Even by 2019, Ashes of Creation had already been burning through its money. And no, not Steven's money, someone else's money, in the tune of millions. To sum this up as fast and efficient as possible, detective style, we start with a reported over whopping $110 million from investors in overall funding, coming from Jason, iDream Sky, a Chinese video game developer publisher, and potentially a few more sources such as Steven's mom as well. An important part of this picture actually, and obviously the more finessed contacts that we haven't mentioned. A reported $10 million from a bank loan, $4 million from Kickstarter, and later a total of $26 million in sales and crowdfunding and more. This is a project that was already more expensive than Throne and Liberty, Terra Online, and even World of Warcraft, and so on and so forth, and had nearly nothing to show for that. But even that money just wasn't enough, as Steven would then love bomb and RP his way more into Jason's heart and more investors somehow acquiring more hundreds of thousands and even millions in the process, making claims that Microsoft had a team ready to inspect and purchase his project. MailRU and Tencent even wanting to purchase rights, and people wanting to even make movies about a game that hadn't come out yet, and much more. The illusion that Ashes of Creation was by the people and for the people was the biggest lie of them all, as Steven took loans out on equity for the company or ownership from the very beginning, even giving up majority portions at points, and that ultimately, private loans formed the entire backbone of the company and development. Throughout the years of this funding leeching, Steven would keep exaggerating numbers promising that they would beat WoW, Fortnite, and even Apex Legends. If these seem like strange and random comparisons because they're nothing like the game is, that's because they're not being used as design comparisons. They're being used to draw excitement and convince that success could happen in a major way, just like these games. It's almost like a rich kid just deciding to, I want to make Fortnite. And that's when you realize the story of Intrepid Studios really is the story of a son without a name or fame and really much skill of his own, living in his mother's MLN and millionaire shadow, deciding to, as investor Jason put it, manifest their own reality around that. Steven's worst quality of all wasn't just being misleading and, as some would say, a scammer. It's that he wasn't very talented, but good at convincing people that he was or capable of producing talent or good work from that. A very convincing man, or just con man for short. Nothing he says in the entire chain of messages is insightful or more impactful than a YouTube comment I've received from one of you guys about one of your favorite virtual worlds. The guy's knowledge of the genre he was burning millions in seemed to not only be incredibly low level, he seemed to be disinterested in learning more about it, including how the market actually worked. The constant comparisons to the battle royale genre throughout it aren't just name recognition plays, they're also evidence that Steven had no idea what he was talking about. Hell, even claims of WoW reaching 13 billion in revenue, as he would say. These things are completely unfounded, when Lineage by all proof has made more than WoW by nearly double, making WoW's actual revenue half of what's being bragged. It's like he would lie and exaggerate even just about random claims, apparently. And yet he was able to convince people to the tune of millions, showcasing two huge problems in the MMORPG and virtual world industry. And that's number one. The only people who will have the capability of helming such a MMORPG or large-scaled online RPG have to be capable at generating a lot of money or already have boatloads of it. And two, the level of talent and knowledge in the industry is incredibly low, that even a low-level MMORPG player can convince investors to part with dozens of millions and also convince developers he knew what he was talking about. And that last bit is driving the knife in just a little bit more. Steven, there's a reason you didn't invite people like me to visit when I was in town minutes away from your studio. It's why you actually surrounded yourself with less experienced developers, despite selling the opposite. I think Steven always wanted to be in charge and feel important, and wanted to be creatively in charge specifically. And I think he's the largest reason we see such unimpressiveness from Ashes of Creation on that front, by the same token. After Steven fails to love bomb Jason some more, we realize as 2020 comes to a start that Intrepid Studios was in serious trouble financially and wasn't even close to the finish line. He was very likely going to have to give up more equity of the company to be anywhere close to that finish line. This was a new section that I added on the 16th of this month, due to the news of the pending lawsuit, where Steven and his husband John Moore are being accused of embezzling funds, or taking large amounts of funding unaccounted for. According to the lawsuit, Steven and his husband stole more than $11 million in funding, which would account for 10% of the project's funding, a non-insignificant amount, likely furnishing a lavish lifestyle, or living in the spotlight, even more richly than before. More reports would state that Steven had even been paying himself a 6-figure salary as well. That's over the course of apparently 10 years. In other news, Apocalypse would end its testing in March of 2020, becoming a forgotten footnote in the story of Ashes of Creation, a footnote that many of the same fans of the game would defend feverishly back then, only to now suddenly not be spotted, delete their account, or make their profile private. Well, I did find a couple of people parroting the same talking points from years ago. The idea was that this was a test that was effective because it tested the server infrastructure and combat. But my single question, for you echoing this still, like an iBot from Fallout, is what did they learn from Apocalypse? And what did they directly implement as a consequence? Don't worry, this is a video you have all day. 2020 would prove to be a challenging year for Ashes of Creation. Not only would their funding start to dry up, Jeffrey Bard, who was previously serving as the game's lead designer, would leave to work in VR instead. Steven and the team, or just Steven, would make the decision to transition to Unreal Engine 5, which wouldn't be as easy as it might sound, requiring significant time and resources, and even years, to make it work properly. This would definitely slow down development for a game that was already 4 years into its development after its announcement. And they started missing deadlines, of course. Intrepid Studios would pick up 2 major veterans during this time, however, such as the lead writer and narrative designer for ESO, or Elder Scrolls Online, and a former lead developer on EverQuest, Bill Trost. Now, while I think the ESO hiring was good, I don't think we ever saw an ounce of what that was supposed to translate to. With the most lore occurring in the game's character creator, where they can force the most text on you. And the Bill Trost hiring is an interesting one. First off, Bill is incredibly talented, being one of the world builders behind EverQuest. What rubbed me the wrong way was how the hiring was being handled and marketed though, which was that this was the Bill Trost, the lead developer on EverQuest. Meanwhile, he wasn't even originally involved in the first prototyping of that game. And Brad McQuaid and Steve Clover were more so involved in the brass tacks of things. I say this not to discredit Bill, but to showcase that his strengths lied not really in design, but more so in world building, an important task in an MMORPG. And even then, that was made in conjunction with 2 other serious designers and a full team to boot. Bill's skills would be needed on Ashes of Creation, certainly, but when the entire thing was supposed to be player-run, how much could he really affect in the project, especially when he joined so late? Some creators can create on a dime, and others need the right circumstances. I think the latter seemed to be the case for Bill, who, by the way, the reason why it annoyed me about the hiring, was also in charge of the creative for all of Amazon Game Studios, the game that hadn't made a single game last longer than a few years of relevance, let alone life. And I met Bill in passing at AGS, and to be honest, my experience wasn't that positive. He seemed pretty full of himself and also not interested at the same time, despite offering nothing of note to the conversations that were being had when I visited the studios. And look, if he was in charge of ideas at AGS, well, that was demonstrably a failure, let's be honest. So this hiring felt more like a lifeline being thrown, much like many of the other hirings, to be fair. Bill likely wasn't going to be able to save things, and depending on Steven's ability to control things, he would have little impact in general. And if he did have the chance and time, I don't believe he had the support system to achieve the success he had in the past. My view of MMO development is simple, despite actually being so complex of a job. If you aren't actually and constantly applying yourself to game theory needed in this genre to your mind and honing your idea skills, which inevitably require, conflict and the ability to kill your set ideas, you're going to fall behind other designers. Video game design might be young compared to other design, but it needs to grow up. And if you aren't this kind of theorist, or have the experience to apply it, you better be a really good or dedicated MMORPG player. And yeah, you heard that right. I will never forget the advice I heard from a founder and creator of Curse, the gaming app, one that now runs a bunch of startups. He said if you ever interview or encounter a top 100 MMORPG player, hire them on the spot. And to be honest, that's been true in my experience. Steven, for example, claims to be a 25-year experienced MMORPG player, lasting longer than the industry at the time of the claim made. Meanwhile, when you watch gameplay of him playing, does he play anything close to someone like me or any of the other vets you watch that, YouTube and stream their content? He reminds me of one of my older friends growing up that I used to play with, who was 68 and like a retired vet. It's not even that the analysis wasn't there, it's that the skill wasn't there either. If Steven had been playing these games for 25 years, he had very little to show for it. But Ashes of Creation had been prepping towards its first Alpha 2 release. Releases that were actually supposed to be, finally, a live test for the actual game systems that they were selling themselves on. Now 7 years after it was first announced. The first one, Phase 1, would drop October 25th, 2024, and it was rougher than sand. These tests were incredibly limited in scope and scheduling, only allowing you to test on the weekends. You can see players and creators like the Lazy Peon, a strong supporter of the game, playing this phase and seemingly only levying compliments at the fact that the game was utilizing the Unreal Engine 5 that had many of the things built in already. TLP though would talk about how poor the new player experience was, which for me was utterly bewildering. If this is indeed an early test meant to test early parts of the game, then why is this not even fixed? How is it possible you guys didn't build this part of the game first and then actually put the effort into it? And TLP, who was actually kind of like quite flowery about the game overall, would call it straight dog shit, which was pretty damning to be fair. The quest log is impossible to read. The quests are seemingly scattered at random with no rhyme or reason, and the story is completely non-existent. And the AI tacky voice acting doesn't make anything better, it only makes it worse. How does this stuff even pass QA? All this money, and you couldn't even pay someone enough money to tell them, the things that they would encounter on their first hour of playing the game? For me, the early testing here just wasn't bad. It was showcasing a mixture of design focuses, all ending in a totally subpar project that feels no better than anything 5 to 6 years older. The only thing people are remotely proud about with the game is that the combat system is better than others at the time, such as like Throne and Liberty. But that combat is also ass, so that's not saying anything at all. And the combat, I think, is worse than a game from 2008, like Warhammer Online. Look at the Lazy Peon playing and clipping through the ground as he talks about enjoying the combat. Sorry, I just don't think there was enough here to hype people up. Unless you just don't compare it to any other MMORPG that's known for combat, or any other game period for that matter. The shield constantly being used here was, well, alpha, but we're talking about a project that's 7+ years in. Alpha being used as a shield, if anything, is a dagger to their own cause, and people not recognizing it as such was worrying to me. Something isn't just something because someone says it is, it has to fit the definition and constraints of what's being described. Words have meaning. Calling Ashes of Creation a product at this point that was already making millions repeatedly in alpha, when it had 100+ million in funding, was disrespectful to game design and project management. But look, I wasn't the only one urging caution. Hell, a top-rated AOC post on their subreddit did the same, but brought actual receipts and new information not really ever before seen. This poster, Shumpro, would urge people to be careful about supporting Ashes of Creation, thinking they had so many red flags that just didn't add up. Ashes of Creation had many liens or bank loans and debts accrued. Despite no public mention of this, as I, said previously, they also had a number of pending lawsuits. Worse, Intrepid Studios had been in trouble with the state of California, where it operated, even being suspended by the FTB, removing their power to operate. The poster is under the assumption they circumvented this somehow, but apparently coincide with when the game stopped selling skins, showing little to no activity from the company following this. So signs were there, but just check out the comment section, with a graveyard of deleted accounts mocking the poster, just because they are okay with a video game that was a subpar product. Some even stated that the game felt 45% complete and were proud of it. Yikes. Guys, we're part of the problem sometimes too as fans. Our toxic fandom and positivity can lead to a delusion that reeks so bad that you smell it from a Fallout vault. This is a game that had a bigger budget and more development time than any of the vast majority of the most successful MMORPGs ever. This ignorance people displayed about that became more than that. It became weaponized as a way for other people to make money. That's why I think it's the perfect game genre to con, really. Because like many who came before it, you can promise the earth and the moon. People ignored those raising the call, as I will detail later on, instead choosing to huff on hopium. So for those who purchased into the early access alpha release that would drop in December of 2025, those people were almost willfully ignorant, and those who advertised it, even more so. Ashes of Creation had become largely sequestered from those that were truly interested in it, shielding it from criticism at large, or the only people who could play it had to spend a whopping few hundreds of dollars. But that would change seemingly out of nowhere, as the project wasn't even being heavily updated anymore reportedly, and would come as a Steam Early Access Alpha 2 phase launch. The fact that that can even be uttered as a sentence is embarrassing, and more embarrassing is the fact that the people were buying into it. Hell, the game was still able to make over $1 million in revenue. Not just because of all the signs pointing to it not being able to be delivered upon, but for the sheer fact that they suddenly rug-pulled the game's entire monetization philosophy, one Steven had mocked other developers about previously, and would start charging a whopping $50 for a supposed alpha. All that chest beating and virtual signaling worked, but it wasn't actually built on anything in reality. Not to mention, this was originally promised 7 years ago. 7 years ago, stop defending this shit. Alpha 1 was supposed to be the same year it launched. It took 4 years to drop. Alpha 2 somehow then took another 7 years after the first announcement. Oh yeah, and in the same mocking, Steven would then claim that New World borrowed ideas. My assumption being that he's probably referring to the node system. A system less complex than the one that I implemented with a friend on a Rust private server nearly 10 years ago, that allowed you to take territory, grow land and NPCs around it, and then wage war on nations through declarations and tax systems. What came next was the expected clown fiesta of many players being shocked. A game now 8 years into development still had fetched quests, graphical glitches and bugs, and a character creation and new player experience that was worse than games that were decades older. Remember, the investors had cut Steven loose at this point. Probably even Mommy did. He didn't have any other money and was now resorting to arguing in the comment section to make his points and had to rely on his former MLN contacts to drum up interest and funding. The studio was burning around $400,000, according to reports, every week. A staggering report, and one that makes you question where this money was actually even going. It also probably explains why they ditched the subscription idea too, as that would take time to make money, and they wanted to make that money now. Regardless, it launched on Steam and would garner a paltry 45%, mostly negative rating, where players felt like they were paying $50 to test an alpha, without seeing the payoff for it. And if you read through the positive reviews, it's the saddest bit of hopium I've ever witnessed, with people almost begging and pleading for them to keep improving the game so as to not let their trust go in vain. Any of the positive reviews you see, you can point out other MMORPGs doing things like that better, and leagues better by that measure. Some even hand-wave other negative reviews. The human psychology of a virtual gamer is truly fascinating, and I will explain why. Or attempt to. We are creatures of habit, and creatures looking for another world to inhabit. This is not an easy task to, follow through with, even in a virtual context. It takes absolute belief to make it work, even theoretically, making you abandon some of your own reason and world in the process. The human psychology of a virtual world gamer is special. They're looking for a place to fit in, to be themselves, to make friends and new relationships, and to become something more. These kinds of players are far more likely to see the bright side in something and believe that some of the rough aspects are just par for the course, due to the inexperienced and young aspects of the genre and, well, the fact that life is a world and also has tons of rough aspects in it, and yet we enjoy it, hopefully. I'm gonna give a good example here. In Star Wars Galaxy's pre-CU, the era before any of the major combat changes would, update and change the game was seen in this kind of like golden age way. The flaws even kind of glossed over time. People even defending them, claiming they were core aspects by design. And if you didn't like them, well, you're just a Care Bear, or just weak and didn't understand shit. In reality, even from the creator of the game's mouth himself, Raph Koster, the idea of spawning in the middle of nowhere, with no lead up or connection and no ability to then draw players in a linear fashion, it's not good game design, even for an MMORPG. And no, it wasn't planned out either. It just was the nature of the earliness of the genre, and the fact that Star Wars Galaxies, for example, didn't even launch with missions or stories. But as I do on the channel, and well, behind the scenes for a living as a QA tester, now turned consultant, I will break down the minute-to-minute gameplay of Ashes of Creation, and the major systems the game featured, so as to better understand who was in the right here. Was the game overhyped? Were people being too cruel? We won't answer that now. The core movement of Ashes of Creation isn't bad. It's based on the Unreal Engine 5, which has some solid base physics and animations. However, it feels just good enough, where none of the movement actually feels unique to that actual MMORPG or game itself. And it brought nothing new or unique to the MMORPG table in terms of movement, tab target or not. The combat, which goes alongside the movement and gameplay, is honestly much more improved compared to where it started out. I'm much more satisfied with it in the current state. Well, at least I was. However, while I think it is improved, the game still suffers from poor visual clarity, where it's hard to know what you're even doing and how the characters or enemies that you are attacking are reacting to said abilities. There's also such a poor class identity in the game that it makes the combat feel more lackluster than it should. I'll explain. How classes work in AOC is actually a combination of two archetypes, creating a class. If this sounds like Rift, well, it kind of is. The problem is it's way worse. Instead of combining two classes complete with two unique trees and skills, kind of like Guild Wars 1, your second archetype in this game merely affects you passively. Yep, that's it. passive changes. You can even see Steven explaining it here on screen, and I fell asleep before he even got done with it. Now, not only do the classes in Ashes of Creation lack identity and uniqueness, the actual variety in the game is very trite and artificial. Half of the time you won't even recognize a class just from watching them fight. Something that like WoW, Warhammer, and Guild Wars 1 all exhibit, being virtual worlds famous for their class identities in combat. The skill in tab-target MMORPGs is a combination of timing and knowledge. Most of the time, it's knowledge though, since the speed of the gameplay is much slower than other gaming genres. But knowledge has to be learned, and you can't identify or learn from playing a game that you can't identify things in. It's just disconnected. And when you get the chance to form a team, with the right team comp and people playing their roles, the game lags or fails to even deliver upon its biggest promises. The big open zones with massive amounts of players and content and PvP. It's laggy, and nearly unplayable at just a few dozen players. And when it does work, it works a bit, satisfying a little bit of that classic MMORPG itch, but those margins and moments are very low, and few and far in between. Worse, the amount of desync in the game is worse than games I've seen with budgets that are only in the 6-digit range, but it just lacks anything that makes it really memorable. Past the combat and forgettable class and abilities and, well, talent system, we have the same unreadable quest log still here, and fetch quest design that seems more intent on ferrying you around than teaching you how to play the game, or about what the game is. Quests are a chance to teach players mechanics, story elements, and connect them more to the world that they're around. In Ashes of Creation, you have no idea why anything is even happening, starting from the first zone in the game, where you encounter sickly goblins populating a random area for seemingly no reason. It's like they thought, hell, let's do Warhammer Online, or Guild Wars 2, but not actually build anything worthwhile or interesting enough to explore. Questing here hasn't evolved at all, and the storytelling hasn't either. There's nothing drawing you into the world of Ashes, not even the unique visuals. If anything, it kind of reminds me of Throne and Liberty, which I just recently covered. Pretty flashes, but a hollow world and a non-impactful art style. They even made a lore reason for putting next to no effort in their world building and lore generation. Civilization is raised from the ashes and must repopulate and redominate the world of Vera, or nodes. Problem being, why is there almost no remnants of civilization that can be spotted besides like the few caves and off structure? And why is there no story tied to any of it? Well, you the player, you have all the burden to create that story, world experience, and thus the connection between the player and the world. Yep, it's all on you guys. If it sounds ridiculous, it should, because it was ridiculous 20 years ago when it was first attempted. It's like they literally went back in time and made a sandbox MMORPG without fleshing the rest of the world out, thinking that that was actually part of the design and story by design. It just works, says Todd Howard in the distance. And the big crowning feature of the game, the factionless warfare and node control systems, aren't even implemented fully. They resemble zone questing with rewards, having less wrinkles to them than Guild Wars 2's world system or war PvP system, which also featured resource generation and war effort aspects. In fact, node wars, as they're called in Ashes of Creation, which are battles that are supposed to take place, over the nodes, are actually just currently cosmetic and don't even grant you a reward. And the idea of people cooperating together to build out nodes ended up in shambles in a jiffy anyway, after some guilds would take control of certain nodes despite not winning a majority of the votes in that election, and would then effectively nerf the region or node, making it worse for other players, or at least more prohibitive. Throw in things like XP loss on death, including if you die to a player who is significantly higher level than you, and you have a collection of systems that are decades old, implemented with seemingly no actual innovations or new sharper design. The worst part to me is that the entire idea of their design was already attempted by New World in the first place and failed at epically, forcing them to even completely backtrack on their game design, becoming a theme park game of which they ultimately failed at. Meanwhile, the survival game genre still exists and dominates in this given respect. Think of it. Most new survival games these days have story in them, so Ashes of Creation was promising to have more impact with less tools of creation than one of those games, while not actually featuring any real story? It was just so bizarre and dated. And take note of Albion Online lately, another sandbox game famous for its, open world combat and full loot PvP, who is running towards factional warfare lately as they realized it had the lowest barrier to entry for massive PvP, which is important. All of these things were going on around Ashes of Creation, and yet no lessons were being learned. The game felt like, once again, it was made in a vault, not released to the world for years, living in a vacuum environment. And MMORPG development, especially being the biggest brother in the virtual world space, requires iterative design. Design that gets better and better, and takes notes from those who come before. That's a large reason I made this series, detectives. It was to educate both fans and developers alike of this notion. Ashes of Creation just wasn't good enough, not for all the money and hype and time involved. Its supposed crowning features were never completed, still being sold on the what-if promises that were never even shown. If these systems were the result of all that money and time, it was a demonstration that the talent was severely lacking and Dunning-Kruger was making many appearances. Because you shouldn't get a participation trophy for merely attempting the hardest game genre when you never even got close to even delivering upon it. And yes, that applies to the rank and file developers here too. Sorry, but even in the ashes, if you will, of a failed project, you can still find quality typically. But what will these developers in this case point to with Ashes of Creation and Pride? I have no idea, but I can't imagine much. Ashes of Creation wasn't just subpar, it was a fantasy game more than just the setting of the game. Sold more on things that didn't exist and never existed, that were promised to come, more than anything it had to show for. I will be blunt, as I have been for the majority of this video, for good reason. If you can't showcase your crowning feature years into the development to completion, it's either time to get a new crowning feature, or just stop kidding yourself and everyone else into thinking you can pull it off. The population of the game would jump up to around 27,859 players peak and just under 20,000 players concurrently, showing how desperate we were as a player base to play something momentous, reportedly still managing to sell 4 to 6 million. Which is still, I think, impressive considering all the red flags and, immorality of the project, something that I've never really invoked in the series before. And that's because what came next shocked everyone. Even the developers left on the project, and Steam themselves. Publicly, suddenly, Intrepid Studios would announce that a WARN Act had been issued, which was 60 days notice of a potential firing or let go of the staff, affecting as many as 210 developers, including 123 of which were working in California. According to Steven, control of the company has shifted away from me, and the board began directing actions that I could not ethically agree with or carry out. As a result, I chose to resign in protest rather than lend my name or authority to decisions that I could not ethically support. Following my resignation, much of the senior leadership would resign. Following those departures, the board made the decision to issue WARN Act notices and proceed with a mass layoff. I cannot responsibly speak to further details at this time due to ongoing legal and governance matters. What I can say is that the developers and staff acted in good faith and deserved better than the uncertainty they are now facing. I am incredibly dismayed at the situation. This made it seem like things were completely out of his hands, Steven that is, and that it was a moment of villainism or something. In reality, as we found out later from more reports at least, including investors and developers involved in the project, the story goes as follows, as far as we know. Steven was indeed running out of money, and his last funding stretches seemed to come from other MLN contacts and friends. Those friends were expecting to see some return on investment. They took control based on debts owed of majority equity, no longer making Steven in charge, to which he would then protest or act like a little kid and take their ball home after being dunked on, and would resign, which would then make the senior leadership do the same, which would then result in the board terminating the staff. While there are reports that the board was reportedly just weeks old and consisted of, one other investor, Steven and his husband, it doesn't include or mention the other serious investors involved in the project that we found out about later on. And also Karen Barreco, while maybe an unsavory character, was then demonized as the one who was forcing these actions. And sure, while some documents were showing that Steven was the only board member, he likely wasn't in charge anymore. I think that this was used as a smokescreen, but not to the degree that people were implying. Instead, Steven clearly wanted to shield himself from more liability, which is why he would reportedly sell his house to his own trust company and then place the blame on those who were expecting him to start paying up finally and not promising more nonsense. Even if what Steven said is true, and he was unfairly forced to make some kind of decision he didn't agree with, eventually at some point when you don't own the majority of your company that you kept essentially this charade going with, stuff like that's gonna happen. And that's when we have a classic Nepo baby exit, where it's everyone's fault, but their own. The problem is, those who face the consequences are now everyone else he roped up into the scheme, including the rank and file developers such as Margaret Crone, who served as the community manager, and was actually my manager back in Guild Wars 2 when I played professionally too. So I trust her account. Margaret would also claim that people didn't even know the game was going to launch until 2 weeks before, and then they were let go without any warning, nor were they paid. Because Steven chose to pull the plug like he did, he basically squandered any chance the development team could make money from the sales at launch, which could have at least helped cover their severances. Almost like a petulant child who couldn't get their way anymore and just decided to ruin the ice cream for everyone else. Look, I don't think Ashes of Creation was very good, but that doesn't mean that it didn't have some hard-working developers caught in this drama crossfire, now without a proper job or financial incentive. If the guy in charge was able to woo everyone else naturally, he was probably good at wooing developers too, at least the less experienced kind seemingly. Ashes of Creation wasn't just an exercise in holding developers or leadership accountable as a player, but as a developer too, because I'm going to say something a bit controversial here. While I totally believe all accounts and hope the multiple lawsuits pending against Ashes of Creation are successful, something in the 7+ range now by the way, I do think that this should serve as a warning to future developers or current developers. If something seems too good to be true and proof isn't in the pudding, it probably is and was too good to be true. And if you're willing to take a paycheck over trusting your gut or artistic morals, you can't be surprised when things go wonky and you're discarded. I know people will take a lot in the name of art and, well, making a living to, live, but there's a reason that the senior leadership at Ashes of Creation post the kerfuffle are either very hands-off or disappeared with the win, and I think it's because they were just there to collect a paycheck, and that was sort of it. The plot would still thicken, somehow, with Miss Breako coming out and claiming that the project was still going to be continuing, with development largely existing in China and being supported by Battle Passes subscriptions and a game gold shop. Oh goody, development was promised to be accelerated. Somehow. But guys, if you're buying this shit, please donate to my channel and Patreon. Seriously, I know this is kind of like a weird segue, but I'm a wizard from the future, and I've come back and I'm saying I need some support so I can keep making these videos. But anyway, who's buying this shit at this point? How would things accelerate? Unless Steven was that much in charge of things before and was stinking up the place, and even if that was the case, why? Why wouldn't creatives not stand for more when the dude was clearly not that talented? Meanwhile, interestingly enough, this Breako is attached to Vima, an MLM wellness company, and another man named Tim Sharif is running another MLM company dubbed 310 Nutrition, where they are apparently offloading loads of Ashes of Creation merch onto Amazon. This screams liquidation to me, as the company who invested so much into the project and was probably a part of one of the people suing Steven, including Jason himself by the way, the project's major sole investor, wants to make some sort of profit out of things, or at least break even. But even if we see Ashes of Creation live on in some form, expect to see a bastardization of the vision and ideas that they were able to sell people on just that, being a vision and ideas. Players would push for refunds, with some being unsuccessful and others realizing the key was to actually go about it in a particular way that forces an actual person to support you instead, which was then proving successful. Due to the nature of Ashes of Creation just launching and the studio behind it being gone, Steam would quietly pull the game from their store, sadly damaging the development team in the process too. Well, detectives, we've reached the end of this timeline, and no, I'm not ready to end the case just yet. No, instead I'm doing something that needs to be done. And approaching a controversial subject, many are quick to avoid. That's accountability. Yep, it's time to do a victory lap of those who were cautious of things and offer good insight, and a ruh-roh lap for those who hyped the game up, elevated the game's platform irresponsibly, and either disappeared after the fact or just came back and seemingly joined it on the other former group instead, as if nothing happened. Let's start with some of the largest culprits: Lazy Peon, Pirate Software, and Zyback TV, and many more. These content creators didn't just glaze the game, they had personal relationships with Steven that I think personally impacted their way of viewing his product. I mean, TLP has 28 videos on the game, of which 24 of them are pretty positive, even when they had almost nothing to show for that. With Zyback, you have a content creator who was just 2 months ago criticizing other content creators and players for being too critical of Ashes of Creation, now making videos about covering the drama, seemingly not making any admissions of their own incorrectness in the process, which you can even see his comment section hold him accountable for on his videos. Look, you guys know I almost never talk about other content creators because it's not my interest to sit here and, blah blah blah, or whatever else. But, I mean, some accountability has to happen. And then we have Pirate Software, a self-reported expert in MMORPGs who worked at Blizzard with the help of his executive father, likely finding kindred spirits in the nepotism that Steven Sharif demonstrated, and joining in on things. PS was literally involved in the project, and hadn't stopped being involved until more recently. His excuse? Well, referrals were never active, and as long as you weren't personally inconvenienced, things should be fine. Now, PS does say sorry, but it feels like a forced sorry. The sorry with no introspection. Meanwhile, the guy used to brag about being best buds with Steven Sharif. We expect more than just a 20-second apology, right? These content creators might not have profited from referrals, but they did assist in the drumming up of excitement and increasing the profile and funding of Ashes of Creation. And if you're going to be there to hype something up, if you want to be taken seriously at least, you better be there to take the L too. But this is the game where now they're going to be covering the fiasco from another angle naturally, or already have. Now, some content creators, of course, were ahead of the curve and warned of some potential red flags, or just to not trust Intrepid could pull off the project. Starting, honestly, with a lot of proper video game journalists who had pretty good records, like Steven Messner from PC Gamer or Justin Olivetti from Massively OP. They urged caution, warning that the team didn't look experienced enough. Meanwhile, Josh Strife Hayes, who like me was way ahead of the curve, warned people about the game over 2 years ago. My own words, as stated from my Kickstarter report card video, show that I was dubious about the funding of the project and didn't like how seemingly deceptive they were being about it. I even found it bizarre they had breached Kickstarter policies yet had no penalty assigned, as if Kickstarter, who plays this independent party, could have played a large part in stopping all of this. Now detectives, this case has come to an end, and another major Kickstarter MMORPG has failed to put their work where their mouth is. But Ashes of Creation was a case like no other, and that case has largely come to an end. I say largely because the lawsuits, plural, are still unfolding, and we will likely see more details come out in Discovery concerning the project and the developer behind them, Intrepid Studios. But our work as of now, in this video, is done. We've gathered enough clues to crack this case. And so, why did Ashes of Creation die and find itself in the Death of a Game series before even reaching a full launch? A forgettable world and non-existent lore, unfinished, overly hyped systems, poor management and development focus, poor or no vision, rug pulled at the end, simply put, a lackluster product for time or money invested, misleading funding and CEO activities. The story starts and ends with Ashes, but the fallout here was different than the titles before. Some might call it doom posting, but I actually think that the community's reception for Ashes of Creation was real, and a much needed one. Yes, there's a lot of I told you so's going on, including in this video, but at this point, why was there ever even so much faith in the project in the first place, when even the ideas they were selling the game on weren't particularly unique or impressive? Hopium, and that's why the crow feeding needed to happen. Having hope is great, and a needed trait in many scenarios, but hope, when you're a paying customer, is just like naivety, really. Sure, some projects succeed from crowdfunding, for example, but if you aren't able to get information like funding information, you should probably have your detective intuition or spidey sense going off, and know that things weren't as they seemed. And for those who got caught into the wave that was Ashes of Creation or the cult of personality that was Stephen Sharif, let this serve as a lesson to you. Not just to not repeat the same mistake again, because that's your own decision or volition, but not doing it again because if you do, you will be a part of what dooms our MMORPG market, or virtual world market, at least temporarily until things can be attempted again. Because the key for this industry to improve is a rising tide raising all boats. That means we need to be a united front. In order for developers to get better at developing these complex games, we have to hold them more accountable and be more educated ourselves. This will take time, for sure, but if we can continue to increase our understanding of this complex space and live with principles, we can naturally sort these sort of projects out properly without letting them get this far before people realize things weren't as they seemed. Thanks for watching, and let me know in the comments below your thoughts on Ashes of Creation and what you liked about the project, or what your opinions were about it before all of this recent stuff happened, and if anything you think I missed concerning why the game ultimately failed. Until the next case.
Into lands uncharted and dangers untold, I venture without fear.